Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are turning in from. It's a pleasure to be learning for you as part of Falzman at Drisha. This is the 2024 annual Renee and Alexander Bohm Memorial Lecture with Dr. Ayelet Hoffmann Libson, titled All Yisrael are Guarantors for Another, the History of a Metaphor. This series is sponsored by the Bohm and Shea families. This lecture uncovers the historical and theological context of the well-known Kol Yisrael of arevim ze bazeh statement. Rather than simply a pithy maxim on the importance of solidarity, we will show that this statement is part of a group of texts which employ financial metaphors to think about the repercussions of sin. Not only Jews, but Christians in late antiquity took very seriously the idea that each and every human action bears great weight and can tilt the heavenly scales towards redemption or oblivion. As a result, these texts often demonstrate profound anxiety about the implications of every person's sin, which is often described in financial terms. The solution to this problem is presented through the metaphor of guarantorship, by which one person's merits accumulated through good deeds can balance the sins of another. This collective community, bound together through the performance of mitzvot, is thus a solution to the challenges of facing divine demands as an individual person. For those who have not had the pleasure of learning with her before, Dr. Ayelet Hoffmann is an associate professor of Talmud at Bar Ilan University. Previously, she taught for 5 years on the law faculty of Reichman University and was a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She is a graduate of Matan's Advanced Talmud Institute and Migdal Oz's Halacha program and has lectured widely in many Batei Midrash, including 2 years at Drisha. She is also an author, having published The Law and Self-Knowledge in the Talmud. And just before we get things going, I want to hand things over to Alyssa to talk a bit more about her relatives in which this is sponsored.
Thank you so much. Very briefly, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this lecture dedicated to the memories of my grandparents, Renee and Alexander Bohm, who were great supporters of Jewish education. And really, without further ado, I would like to just begin the lecture with Professor Ayelet Hoffmann Libson. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Alyssa, for those words. And Dr. Hoffmann, I hand things over to you.
Thank you. So it's very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Alyssa and the Bohm family. Thank you to Drisha. The topic of this lecture is Kol yisrael arevim ze bazeh. So I think it's only appropriate, in addition to honoring the Bohm family with this lecture, also to dedicate this lecture in the merit of the chatufim, the captives, and all those who are injured in Israel as well, and all those who are fighting for the solidarity of Israel more broadly at these very moments. I'm going to lecture for the next 50 minutes or so, and then leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So you can either write down for yourselves questions as we go along, or if you'd like, you can post them in the chat, but I won't be able to respond to them as we're going along. I'm also going to share my screen right now. So you won't see much of me, you'll mostly see my screen throughout the lecture. Okay, so the phrase Kol yisrael arevim ze bazeh is often translated as all of Israel are responsible for one another. And this idea often is invoked if you just do a quick Google search or think of when you've heard it used in contexts before. It's often understood as an idea that every person of Israel should stand in solidarity with other people, just as we opened now. And there's a kind of aspect of caring for other people and having a sense of, family, of this is the group of people for whom we care and for whom we are responsible for beyond our nuclear family. But if we listen to this phrase more literally, right, the phrase Kol Yisrael arevim ze baze, then we notice the imagery that's being used to convey this idea of solidarity or of responsibility. And the word arevim actually means not all of Israel are responsible for one another, but a much more specific technical legal meaning. All of Israel are guarantors for one another. And guarantorship is not just a bond of caring or solidarity, but it's a very, very particular bond between people. This is both a legal and a financial metaphor. Now, this metaphor appears first. So on the verse in Vaikra, the verse in the Tochecha, which talks about what will happen when people are, when God punishes the people of Israel, the pasuk says, "V'chashlu ish be'achiv kemipnei cherev v'rodef ein, ve'lo tiye lachem tkuma lifnei oivechem." They shall stumble one by his brother as before the sword, with no one pursuing, meaning even though there's nobody pursuing, they'll be stumbling over one another, and you shall not be able to stand your ground before your enemies. Now, on this verse, the Midrash says a very interesting thing. It reads the words, "V'chashlu ish be'achiv," but it says, "V'chashlu ish be'achiv eino omer ish be'achiv." So even though the verse does actually say, "V'chashlu ish be'achiv," the Midrash here is saying it does not say one by his brother, but rather, "Ela ish be'avonot achiv," but rather one by the sins of his brother. Now, why is the Midrash making this strange move? It seems that the Midrash is it's focusing on the letter bet in the phrase "v'chashlu ish be'achiv," right? And it's saying, it's reading that bet not as one over the other, but rather as biglal, as because of. Okay, so they stumbled not one over the other, but they stumbled one because of the other. And from this, the Midrash derives, melamed shekol Yisrael arevim ze baze. This teaches that all of Israel are guarantors for one another. So the Sifra is introducing this idea of arevut. Now, what exactly is an arev, a guarantor? A guarantor is someone who pays the debt if you default on your debt. So the role of the arev is not to be kind and caring and to pick up the phone and ask how you are, but rather the role of an arev is someone who's in a legal relationship. So this isn't an image of caretaking, but rather it's an image of a legal and financial relationship. Someone who's going to stand behind you, and if you have to default on your loan, they're going to step in and pay the debt instead of you. Another source uses very similar imagery to tell us what is the origin of this idea of arevut. Where does this come from? Where did arevut develop from? And in a midrash on the beginning of the Decalogue in Exodus 20, the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael offers the following homily. Rabbi Omer, להודיע שבחן של ישראל, שכשעמדו כולם לפני הר סיני לקבל את התורה, והשבו כולם לב אחד לקבל מלכות אלוהים בשמחה. So when the people of Israel stood at the foot of Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, they made their hearts as one to receive the kingdom of God with joy. ולא עוד, אלא שהיו ממשכנים זה על ידי זה. So moreover, they made themselves into a mashkon. They made themselves into collateral, one for the other. ולא שלכך, אלא שנגלה הקדוש ברוך הוא לכרות עמהן ברית על הסתרים, שנאמר הנסתרות לאדוני אלוהינו והנגלות lanu. So God revealed himself to covenant with them, to covenant with the people of Israel, specifically concerning the concealed things. As it's written in the verse, "Hanistarot leHashem Eloheinu v'aniglot lanu." The concealed things are for the Lord our God. But the people of Israel said to God, "Amru lo al hagluyin anu kortin imcha brit, velo al hastarim, שלא יהיה אחד ממנו חוטא בסתר, ויהיה הציבור מתמשכן." So they said to him, we're ready to covenant, we're ready to accept the revealed things, but we're not ready to covenant with you concerning the concealed things. Why not? שלא יהיה אחד ממנו חוטא בסתר, ויהיה הציבור מתמשכן. So it should not be that one person sins in concealment, one person sins behind closed doors, and the whole congregation should be taken as collateral. So here, the word used is not the idea of, is not arevut, not guarantorship, but it's also an idea of collateral, of a financial relationship. Now, according to this midrash, the Israelites recognized that God wouldn't be ready to give his brit, his covenant, without a guarantee. And so they collectively pledged themselves as collateral for one another. And thereby they allowed God to also exact payment, which is really punishment, from one Israelite for the sins of another. So what this midrash is suggesting is that in order for God to give the Torah, he wanted to see that there would be some kind of guarantee, some kind of collateral, and the people of Israel became the collateral one for the other. And we see that the midrash twice uses this metaphor of collateral, of mitmashkenim, from the word mashkon, which means a pledge or collateral for a loan. In the first instance, the midrash says that not only did the Israelites receive the kingdom of heaven joyfully, but they also made themselves as collateral one for another, meaning every individual for every other individual of Israel. And in the second instance, the midrash doesn't talk about one individual being collateral for another individual, but rather that the whole tzibur, the whole congregation, is collateral for the sin of one individual. And the congregation agrees to do this only for revealed or witnessed sins, but not for the sins committed in secret, because, and you can see how that means that the Mechilta is taking this legal idea very seriously. It's not just a metaphor, it's a serious idea, which is indicating that because every individual is really the guarantor, the collateral for another Israelite, then I'm not ready to be the guarantor for whatever goes on behind your closed doors. I'm only ready to be the guarantor for what I know about, okay? For what I could stop, for what I could give you tochecha and ensure that you won't perform this avera. So these sources, both the Sifra that we saw about Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh and the Mechilta about the Mashkon, both have in common the legal metaphors of debt repayment. And they're both assuming a three-way relationship. This is not only a relationship between a debtor and a creditor, but in both cases, there's also a third party. There's the guarantor who's ready to give the collateral. But the question is, what exactly is the loan that we're talking about? What is the loan for which you have to give collateral or for which you have to have a guarantor? And in order to understand this, we have to go back to a radical transformation that Chazal made in the Jewish concept of sin. When we look at the Tanakh, we see two main images of sin. There's a few additional images, but if we try to streamline things, when we look at the biblical worldview, the main metaphors that are used for sin are one, sin as a burden, and two, sin as a stain. So when we think about sin as a burden, we can think about what we read in the previous week's parasha, when Cain says, "Gadol avoni minso," right? My sin is too great. It's too great a burden to carry. Or we could think about Yeshayahu, who says, "Hoi goy chote am keved avon," right? A sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity. Or in the psukim that we recite in the core of the slichot, where God is described as noseh avon, the carrier, the bearer of sin. So that's one central metaphor that the Bible uses over and over again. And the other metaphor that is used very frequently is the metaphor of sin as a stain. Again, these metaphors come up a lot in the prayers of the Yamim HaNoraim. So for example, a verse that we recite often on Yom Kippur, Yeshayahu says, "Im yiyu chata'echem kashanim kasheleg yalbinu," right? If your sins will be like crimson, they can turn snow white. They can be washed. Or in Tehillim, the author of Tehillim says, "Herev kabseni me'avoni u'michatati titahareni." Wash me thoroughly of my iniquity and purify me of my sin. So these are the two central metaphors that are employed for sin in the Tanakh. And another characteristic of the way sin is described in the Tanakh is that it's often associated with a collectivist approach to sin. So in general, if we look at the Tanakh, we can say that a person's fundamental identity is not primarily as an individual, but as part of a broader social group. And for this reason, the deeds of one person can lead to the punishment of the collective. So, for example, we can see this in the famous pasuk, "Avot achlu boser v'shinei banim tikena." Parents have eaten sour grapes, and the teeth of the children are blunted, which raises many moral issues in later literature. But for the Bible, that doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be a problem in that idea. And this idea of collective responsibility is found in many stories in the Tanakh, not only on a familial level of the parent and the child, but also on a national level as well. Most famously, perhaps, according to Perek Zayin of Yoshua, Joshua 7, Achan took from the spoils of Yericho, which were under a ban, but as a result, there were many more people who fell in the next battle against the city of Ai. And the narrator describing that story describes Achan violating the ban, but also says, "And the Israelites violated the ban. And the Lord was angry with all of the Israelites." So we can see how in many instances, one person can sin in the Tanakh, but many people will be punished on account of that sin. So in the biblical worldview, sin is understood to be the responsibility not only of the individuals, but of the community as a whole. And the whole collective is held accountable for the deeds of individual constituents. And this was really a core theological doctrine in ancient Israel. And we can see its implications in many different places in the Tanakh, that God's connection is, God has a connection with individual people, but also has a relationship with the entire nation. And as a consequence, each member of that collective bears some degree of responsibility for the actions of fellow community members. And this also means that not only a person doesn't have accountability also for your own conduct, but also a duty to prevent other people from wrongdoing. However, towards the end of the biblical period, we begin to see a shift, both in the way that individuals are thought of, and also in the metaphors that are used for individuals' sin. And we begin to see a new metaphor creeping in right at the end of the biblical period. And this metaphor is the metaphor of sin as debt. In the Second Temple period, we find that this financial and legal metaphor is found in many different literatures of early Jews, especially in the Dead Sea Scrolls, also in the New Testament. And in rabbinic literature, we really find this metaphor exploding. And in fact, if you think about it, the metaphor of sin as a debt, as a chov, underlies almost all of rabbinic language about sin and about merit, to such an extent that we as rabbinic Jews no longer even notice that we are using financial language on a daily basis. So just to give a few examples, the financial metaphor of sin as debt conceptualizes mitzvot and sins as merits and demerits in a kind of heavenly bank account. So when the Mishnah wants to say that something isn't permitted, it says one is chayav, one is a debtor if one performs this action. And one who performs a permitted action is patul. Someone who performs a mitzvah is zakai, which actually means a creditor. And when we perform mitzvot, what do we receive? We receive sachar. What is sachar? It's payment. But if we don't perform mitzvot, then God has to collect his debt. How does he collect his debt? He collects his debt through puranut, through a catastrophe, which is the same root as the word para, which means to collect a debt. So God's way of collecting debt is from someone who has a lot more sins than merits, or who has severe sins, is to bring about a puranut. And if we want to refrain from this terrible outcome of puranut, we ask God for mechila, a root which actually means giving up a debt, relinquishing my debt. And again, in the High Holy Day liturgy, we say this explicitly all the time. We say, Mechal lanu, Avinu Malkenu, Mechok berachamecha harabim kol shitrei chovotenu, right? Our Father and our King, in your multiple mercies, erase the bonds of our debt. So we are constantly using this metaphor. It's underlying much of our thought, which is really kind of, when we step out and look at it for a moment, we can notice that actually this metaphor underlies a whole model which thinks about the calculation of a person's spiritual merits and debits as a kind of marketplace model. And indeed, the whole purpose of the mitzvot is really to gain as many credits as possible. As we say, as the Mishnah in Masechet Makot famously says, and we say this often at the end of our learning, Ratzah Kadosh Baruch Hu lezakot et Yisrael, lefichach hirba lehem Torah u'mitzvot, right? The Holy and Blessed One wanted to confer merit upon the Jewish people, and therefore he multiplied for them Torah and mitzvot, so they would have many opportunities for zchuyot. So this is a completely different metaphor from the metaphor of sin as a burden or sin as a stain, and it focuses on sin as debt. Now, this metaphor also has to do with the changes in how the individual is thought of after the biblical period. Because if we think about the metaphor of sin as a debt, this metaphor is focused on the individual person because it assumes a relationship between two individuals, the debtor and the creditor. And while biblical sources have a more collective view, as we said, of responsibility for sin, the rabbis are putting forth a new model which emphasizes not only the responsibility of every person, but also the responsibility of every individual action. Every single mitzvah accrues a merit, and every single sin accrues demerit. However, we have to remember that the rabbis are still heirs to the biblical conception of collective responsibility. And therefore, with this new metaphor for sin and individual responsibility, there are also tensions that begin to emerge with the older biblical model. And we can see this in the following Tosefta in Masechet Kiddushin, which has 3 sections which discuss what happens when a person performs a mitzvah. So the first section says, העושה מצווה אחת, מטיבין לו ומאריכין לו ימיו ושנותיו, ונוחל את האדמה. One who performs one mitzvah has benefits bestowed upon him, and his days and years are lengthened, and he inherits the land. וכל העובר עבירה אחת, מרעין לו ומקטפין את ימיו, ואין נוחל את הארץ. Anyone who transgresses one transgression is dealt with unkindly, and his days are plucked off, and he does not inherit the land. ועל זה נאמר, וחוטא אחד יאבד טובה הרבה. About this it is said, one sinner will lose much good. בחטא יחידי שעשה זה, איבד ממנו טובות הרבה. Through a single sin that he did, he has lost many benefits. So the Tosefta is proposing 2 novel innovations against the backdrop of biblical and Second Temple sources. First, mitzvot and sins are individual and not collective, okay? So we're focusing on the person, ha'oseh mitzvah achat, the one person who does the mitzvah. And secondly, it's mitzvah achat, meaning every individual mitzvah gains reward, while every individual sin leads to punishment. And the punishment here is conceptualized as eino nochel et haaretz. And inheriting the land here probably refers to reward in the world to come, as in Mishnah Sanhedrin, which ties the verse ve'amech kulam tzadikim leolam yirshu aretz to reward in the world to come, right? When it says kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek leolam haba, שנאמר, והמך כולם צדיקים לעולם ירשו הארץ. So the symmetry between sins and merits is very, very clear in this Tosefta. And this symmetry is related to a group of images that portray sins and merits as written in a book or weighed on scales. And we recognize these images, again, especially from the liturgy. But when we think about what that image is about, especially the image of the scales, right? As a result of that image, one sin can actually be repaid through the payment of a zchut, of a merit. So for example, Psikta de Rav Kahana describes God himself, who wants to create a situation that a person's merits will be heavier than the sins. So God snatches a sin off the scale so that the merits will be heavier. Rabbi Elazar says, Kaf moznaim meuyenet, the set of the scales is balanced. Avonot mikan uzchuyot mikan, sins on one side and merits on the other side. V'akadosh baruch hu chotef shtar echad mishel avono uzchuyot machriot. Okay, so notice again the language that God snatches a bond, snatches one of the sins, but the language that's used here is a bond of sin, and then the merits weigh down. And this approach is elaborated in the continuation of the Tosefta. The next section of the Tosefta says that for this reason, לעולם יהא אדם רואה את עצמו כאילו חציו זכאי וחציו חייב. A person should always see oneself as though half meritorious and half liable. עשה מצווה אחת, אשריו שהכריע את עצמו לכף זכות. עבר עבירה אחת, כאילו שהכריע עצמו לכף חובה. Oh, sorry, ilu, oilo, okay, woe to him. So if one performs one mitzvah, ashrav, he's fortunate, for he's tipped himself to the side of merit. But if he commits one transgression, woe to him, for he has tipped himself to the side of debt. על זה נאמר, וחוטא אחד יאבד טובה הרבה, the same verse we saw earlier. But now it's interpreted differently. בחטא יחידי שעשה זה, איבד ממנו tovot harbe. Okay, the same interpretation, but now the emphasis is slightly different. Now the emphasis is that as a consequence of this heavenly ledger of debts and merits, every person also has to keep a very close account at all times of your transgressions and your merits to ensure that you're going to receive reward rather than punishment. So we can see how this metaphor of sin as debt is really focused on the individual person and the person's responsibility for one's future reward and punishment. And for this reason, we have to take constant note of every person's moral account. However, this highly individualized way of thinking about sin and merit led to some difficulties in relating to the significance of the collective, which the rabbis had inherited from the biblical worldview. And we can see this difficulty in the next section of the Tosefta. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer, mishum Rabbi Meir, לפי שהיחיד נידון אחר רובו, העולם נידון אחר רובו. Since every single individual is judged based on the majority of his or her actions, the world too is judged based on the majority of its actions. עשה מצווה אחת, אשריו שהכריע את עצמו ואת העולם לכף זכות. So if one performs one mitzvah, he's fortunate, for he has tipped himself and the whole world to the side of merit. עבר עבירה אחת, אוי לו שהכריע את עצמו ואת העולם לכף חובה. Right? If he commits one transgression, woe to him, for he has tipped himself and the whole world to the side of debt. ועל זה נאמר, וחוטא אחד יאבד טובה הרבה, בחטא יחידי שעשה זה, איבד ממנו ומן העולם טובות הרבה. So through a single sin that he performed, he's lost many benefits for himself and for the whole world. So unlike the initial viewpoint presented in the Tosefta, which understands these celestial scales of justice to be assessing each individual separately, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is arguing that every action undertaken by a person holds repercussions, not only for that person, but also for the entire world. So we can see here two models in the Tosefta for thinking about an individual's sins and merits. The first approach highlights the consequences of every sin or merit for an individual's fate, and the second approach emphasizes the impact on the broader collective. Now, what's interesting is that this grappling with the importance and the impact of one person's action on the collective wasn't only a Jewish consideration. We can see when we look at Christian sources as well, that they're also grappling and wrestling with the same dilemma. And we see this particularly in Romans 5, where Paul wrestles with the question of how is it feasible for one man to offer redemption for all others, which is really one of the core messages of Paul and of Christianity in general. How can one person redeem all the other people? And his argument hinges on the idea that sin entered the world through Adam HaRishon's actions and then impacted the entirety of humanity. And he says as follows, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned, right? Originally, there was no death and no sin, but this through Adam, sin came into the world and then death came into the world. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. Okay, so Adam prefigures Jesus later on. But the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many died through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. And the free gift is not like the result of that one man's sin. For the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brought justification. For if, because of one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. Therefore, as one trespass led to the condemnation for all men, okay, so just as one sin at the beginning of time led to sin spreading to everyone, so one act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all men. For as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. So we can see here that both Romans and the Tosefta have similar assumptions, and they're grappling with the same problem. How can the actions of one individual impact the entire world? And they're both operating on the premise that a single sin or righteous act has repercussions for others. And Paul is actually making the very same argument as Rabbi Shimon in the Tosefta. One mitzvah leads to justification for all people, and one transgression leads to condemnation for all people. But we can also see where their perspectives diverge. Paul is positing that it was one man who introduced sin for everybody and one man who redeemed everybody. The rabbis are saying, yes, it could be one person who can exert this collective influence, but it's not one historical person. It's every individual can have this collective influence. So they have a shared concern with this issue of collective responsibility, but they have differing interpretations. Now, we can see this also in several other Christian sources, but I can see that my time's running out a bit, so I think I'm actually going to skip them a little bit. Let me skip ahead. What I want to emphasize through bringing Romans, and also I'll just paraphrase maybe a little bit, that this idea that humanity has a bond of debt and the belief that Jesus repaid this bond through his death becomes a very central idea. It's cited hundreds of times by Syriac and Greek and Latin theologians of the first century. And it became a cornerstone of the idea that, that one man can actually, in his death, represent a victory over all the powers which hold mankind in bondage, right? Over sin, over death, over the devil. And in this framework, humanity's collective indebtedness to God because of Adam and Eve's sin is central. And Jesus actually settled that death through his sacrificial death. Now, as we've seen, the rabbis are also grappling with this problem of collective debt. But what I'm suggesting is that even though they're grappling with similar questions, they have a different resolution to this problem. And the resolution to this problem is by introducing a third character into the legal and economic metaphor of debt. So in all the sources that, in all the Christian sources that we've seen, or that I've paraphrased for you, there's a relationship of debt, right? Humanity has a debt towards God. So there's a debtor and there's a creditor. The rabbis managed to resolve this problem of how an individual person impacts the collective by introducing a third character. So we don't have only the debtor and the creditor, but we also have the guarantor, right? Just as we saw in the Midrash, in the Mechilta, that the Israelites accepted, when they received the Torah, they accepted the responsibility of being collateral for one another. They were willing to be the mashkon or the arev for one another. And the significance of this economic metaphor of the mashkon or arevut, of collateral, I'm suggesting can be understood based on the metaphor of sin as debt. It's actually an expansion of that metaphor. So the metaphor of debt, as we've seen, suggests that every individual has sole responsibility for future reward or punishment. And the metaphor of the guarantor builds on the metaphor of sin and debt and underscores that in a relationship of debt, there may be not only the debtor and the creditor, but also a guarantor is involved. And that's a way of extending the responsibility and the consequences between the individual person to the collective community. So both the Sifra, which talks about Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh, and the Mechilta, which talks about Yisrael mimashkenim atzmam ze lazeh, both of them indicate that guarantorship is a collective metaphor. In the Mechilta, the Israelites pledge themselves as collateral for one another, while in the Sifra, they act as guarantors for one another. And if we build on the Psikta de Rav Kahana, which we saw earlier about God snatching the sins off the scales, we can also understand how exactly this arvut works. So just as in the Psikta de Rav Kahana, God can seize the sin of one individual and tip the balance in favor of an individual's merits. Similarly, if we imagine that there's a communal treasury where each person's deeds affects everyone else's, then one person's merits can also stand as collateral for another person's sins. So both of these metaphors are actually suggesting they're a kind of calming mechanism, I would say. They're saying to you, okay, you have your individual notebook where your sins and your merits are written down. But remember that behind you, you also have the collective of Israel. So even if you're having a really bad year and you have more averot than mitzvot, you have more sins and transgressions than merits, I can lend you some merits from my bank account and put them in your bank account, okay? So in that way, I am a collateral for you, you're collateral for me, and everyone can feel a little bit calmer when they stand before God, knowing that one person's merits can stand in as collateral for another person's sins. One important difference between the rabbinic and the Christian perspective on these questions is that the rabbinic metaphor of a guarantor refers to all of Israel, whereas the New Testament passages seem to be concerned with humanity as a whole. However, in some sources, we also see that we see a little bit of sliding from one perspective to another. So for instance, in some New Testament sources, we read that Jesus isn't the guarantor of everybody, of all of humanity, but specifically of the people who have accepted his covenant. And conversely, in the Sifrei to Deuteronomy, we read, Kol Kedoshav Beyadecha, Elu Gdolei Eretz Yisrael Shenitmashkenim al Kol Yisrael. So all his holy ones are in your hands. These are the great ones of the land of Israel who make themselves collateral for all of Israel. Okay, and we won't go into the proof text here, But what the Sifrei is suggesting here is that it's actually not all of Israel who can be a mashkon, but rather only people of stature, only people who are the Gdolei Eretz Yisrael. And why does it suggest that? It seems to be a result of taking this metaphor very seriously, okay? And if we take the metaphor very seriously, that I can give you collateral for my bank account, well, in that case, it depends who I am, right? If I'm a wicked and sinful person, then presumably I don't have so many credits in my bank account that I can give you as collateral. And so it's only the Gdolei Eretz Yisrael who can be the mashkon, the collateral for other people. So the Sifrei is actually showing us how seriously this metaphor is taken, right? That it actually creates questions about the effectiveness of each person as an arev, as a guarantor, and suggests that only people who are really have many credits can be guarantors for others. I want to conclude by showing a little bit, just in one brief example of the ramifications of this idea. The idea that sins are what ties the people of Israel together is actually the inverse of the idea that mitzvot tie us together. And that idea pops up in various contexts. I want to focus on one specific context here. In Masechet Rosh Hashanah, the Mishnah discusses the idea of blowing the shofar for other people. And it raises the question, and the Gemara discusses this question: how can it be that if I've already fulfilled my obligation, I can still fulfill the obligation for another person? So if I've already blown the shofar, how can I now, I'm no longer chayevet, right? And the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah itself also says, Kol she'eno mechuyav b'davar, eno metzi et harabim yedei chovatam. So anyone who's not obligated in something can't discharge the obligation of another. So let's say that I've already blown the shofar. Well, I've discharged my obligation. So how can it be that I now can go to, an old age home, or can go to someone's house who can't come to shul and blow the shofar for them as well, especially since I have to recite the bracha again. And when I'm reciting the bracha for a mitzvah that I'm no longer obligated in, then actually maybe this is a bracha lebatala. Maybe I'm taking God's name in vain. So the Gemara discusses this issue of discharging another person's obligation. And Ava Brei de Rabbi Zera says in the Talmud there, Kol habrachot kulan af al pi sheyatza motzi. With regard to all blessings, even if one fulfilled one's own obligation, one can discharge another person's obligation. Chutz mibirkat halechem vebirkat hayayin, she'im lo yatza motzi, ve'im yatza eno motzi. Okay, except for the blessing recited over bread and the blessing over wine, that with regard to these blessings, only if you haven't yet discharged your own obligation, you can discharge someone else's obligation. But you've already discharged your own obligation, then you can't discharge the obligations of others. And I want you to see how Rashi explains this statement by Ava Brei de Rabbi Zera. Rashi says, Af al pi sheyatza motzi. שהרי כל ישראל arevim ze בזה lemitzvot. So everyone, even though all of Israel are guarantors for one another, specifically, and I didn't put this in the translation, specifically with regard to mitzvot. Okay, so that's the reason that even though I already discharged my obligation, I can still discharge the obligation of another person. And this is not true for blessings over wine and bread. And as Rashi says, any other bracha over fruit and over scents, because that's not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah to eat something or take a sniff of something that smells good and then have to say a bracha. But mitzvot, that's what ties all of Israel together. And that's why only with regard to mitzvot, even if you discharge your obligation, you can still discharge the obligation of another person. So personal obligations are not just every individual's obligations, but they also tie people together. The community is tied together through these mitzvot. So to summarize, the early texts that we saw demonstrate that both the rabbis and early Christians were preoccupied with this relationship between individual sins and mitzvot and the role of collective responsibility. And the metaphor of sin as debt became the predominant metaphor in the early centuries CE. And as a result, the rabbis developed the concept of guarantorship as a kind of secondary metaphor, which is piggybacking on the metaphor of sin as debt, so as to bridge the individualistic nature of the debt metaphor together with other ideas of collective responsibility. And this metaphor suggests that what ties the community together is not just solidarity or caretaking, although of course those are important things, but when we look at this metaphor of kol yisrael arevim ze lazeh and kol yisrael memashkenim atzmam ze lazeh, we can see that what actually ties the community together is not just solidarity, but law, halacha. Law is what creates a bond between all of the people of Israel. And one of the consequences of that bond is that I can cover your debt with my merits. So every person is not only in a personal vertical relationship of debt in which we are the debtors and God is the creditors, but rather the rabbis introduced a third person into this relationship, the guarantor. So we're all not only in a vertical relationship with God, but also in a horizontal relationship with the rest of the people of Israel, in which every action that I perform, whether a mitzvah or a transgression, impacts not only me, but also every other Jew in the community. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hoffmann-Libson. I have a couple of questions that I want to highlight in chat. I'm going to be doing this in a bit of reverse chronological order. And if I don't get to your question, I'm really sorry. You can email Drisha, and I'm happy to pass along future questions. First question up from Don Bender, asking, I'd be interested to see the Christian sources.
Okay, I can send along the rest of the PowerPoint with pleasure.
All right, then from Pearl Haravan, it would seem that Judaism is responsible for the continued existence of the world as well.
It would seem that what is responsible for the continued existence of the world?
Judaism is responsible for the continued existence of the world as well.
Okay, I'm not sure I understood that question, but I think maybe
Pearl, if you're still on the call, if you want to jump in. Otherwise,
yeah, maybe.
I'm going to jump on to a comment from Ozzy Orbach earlier, about a half hour ago.
Wait, I just want to clarify my question that it says al shloshat dvarim ha'olam hamed al Torah avodah al gemilut chasadim, which seems to imply that the world exists because of Judaism's dealing with Torah, with good works, and with kindness.
Right. So what, I don't understand the question. Is it?
You said that Christianity believes that the world exists because of whatever belief in the New Testament, but
Okay.
said that Judaism just believes as far as more restricted, as far as just the Jewish community is responsible one for the other, but not for the entire.
Right. I mean, I think that actually echoes the themes that we see in this lecture, right? That every person's action, gemilut chasadim, is also something that sustains the world, right? So every person's individual actions are impacting the world's ongoing existence. And that seems to be in line with what we see in the Tosefta as well.
Okay.
All right, and I see a lot of really good comments in chat. I just want to open it up to people to ask on camera. I have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Oh, can I ask
Someone else
something?
speak? Yes.
Can I speak? Hi, thank you. The one question I have is, your Jesus model is Jesus works for all generations, past and future, and the Christian model. Does this Jewish model here of arevut work only in our current generation? In other words, in our generation now, what I do or can do or other people do affects us. But what about this? Someone had mentioned the chat, zchut avot, or does it transcend time? What I do now could be good for someone in the future.
Okay, great question. And I actually have a source ready for you to answer that question. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint again. Here you could see another midrash from a different Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Sorry, it's not translated, but I'll translate it as we go along. The midrash also talks about Matan Torah, Vayityatzvu b'tachtit hahar. And here we have the famous idea of Melamed shekafa kadosh baruch hu alehem et hahar kegigit. However, at the midrash then continues. If you look at the fourth line, Amar kadosh baruch hu arevim ani tzarich. I require guarantors. Amru harei shamayim va'aretz. So the people of Israel said, "Great, the heavens and the earth can be our guarantors." Amar le'en betelin hen. No, God didn't accept their guarantorship. Amru avoteinu ya'arvunu. Let our forefathers be our guarantors. Amar le'en asikin hen. No, they were occupied with other deeds that they've already performed. Amru baneinu ya'arvunu. Our children will be our guarantors. Amar harei arevim tovim. V'chen hu omer mipi olalim v'yonkim yisad et ha'oz. So in this midrash, the midrash is thinking about, the arevut transcending time, but surprisingly, in contrast to the idea that's more familiar to us of zchut avot, of the merit of the forefathers, here the midrash is saying that actually future generations are going to be the collateral. And why is that? I think that what the midrash is trying to say here is that the fact that future generations will continue to study and to observe the Torah, that's the best collateral that God can have in order to agree to grant the Torah, the fact that it will continue and will be passed on to future generations. Any other questions?
I think we're kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to have to say thank you so much to everyone who's asked questions in chat or has questions. You can reach out to me at inquiry.drisha.org, which I'm going to post in chat for everyone. And with that, I want to wish everyone a good day and a good afternoon and a good evening, depending on where in the world you are turning in from. Thank you very much to Dr. Hoffmann Libson for today's class. And with that, I want to remind you that we have more Fall Spawn classes at drisha.org/classes. You can check things out, see our available classes, and sign up if any of them interest you. With that,
Thank
I
you.
want to wish everyone
Thank you.
a good day.
Thank you. This
Thank
was
you.
great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There.